I'm going to talk about fees, different kinds this time, looking at L1s. There have been a lot of work on these transaction fee mechanisms, multidimensional pricing, all that. But today we're just going to start from like basic principles from an economist perspective. There are essentially three different types of fees, blockchain fees of three types. One in which you just fix max block size limit, and this is what I would call like a quantity setting regime. Choice example is essentially Bitcoin, and we let the rest be chosen by validators, miners, or and they can do essentially some sort of a first price auction. The other one is more of the where you kind of start saying, okay, I'm going to introduce a minimum price. You can think of Ethereum case, EIP 5059 update is kind of like that, though even if there is a limit, but overall, in normal times, this is what is the most playing a role. You have like say, minimum price to control these fixed block size. And there are also the multidimensional variations as well. You can think of our work speaking to both. And there are also ones where you actually don't have any market mechanism, where I'll just denote here by the empty set, where you're just going to have a fixed unit price, you put default fees or block size limit until the blockchain matures, until you have congestion issues. So the question I'm going to try to address, which is foundational one here, I think, which is what specificities of a blockchain lead to these two regimes, okay? Whether the minimum price setting regime, I call like the minimum price, or the quantity setting regime, where you just put a block size limit, where you have this contention here, where the blockchain designers, they want to maximize a sense of welfare, but validators, they want to maximize the profits, the rewards that they get from their activity. Now, so this is ChatGPT helped generate this. So we'll be looking at this very extreme price setting versus quantity setting. I wanted to just mention this is because one of the first paper I wrote on this. Then you can think of general supply choice function. So we're going to look at each of the specificities, technical specificities of blockchains. How do they translate into some economic notions? And what does it tell us where we want to go? Do you want to do something more like EIP 5059 or just use a simple mechanism? So let me use an example. So in fact, when Ethereum introduced the EIP 5059, Vitalik read an economics paper about environmental regulation. So I'm just going to explain this simple idea there and explain what is different, that when you go beyond that, you need to think of this more carefully. So consider, for example, that there is, let's say, a marginal social cost that is pretty stable here. You have quantities, let's say, on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. And you have demand for, let's say here, block space, private demand. So imagine now you put a block size limit, okay? It's lower than the demand here at that marginal social cost. So this shaded area here is what economists call the deadweight loss, which is just that there is all this welfare that people would be happy about, but is not present because it's this low quantity limit when the demand is high. So now imagine we are in a situation where this demand is uncertain, right? Sometimes you can have low demand, which is the shaded line below for block space. Sometimes you can have high demand for block space. Now, in this situation, this shaded area, okay, half of the shaded area here, which is the gap from the high demand to the social marginal cost, contribute will be the deadweight loss, okay? And now the inside is when you have this demand uncertainty, what happens is it's actually useful to, instead of just having this block size limit, let's say you say, okay, now instead let me introduce a minimum price, okay? And you can set it in such a way, like I did here. Like think of then the base fee that the Ethereum does. But this minimum price, I can set it in such a way that now if you look at here, my new deadweight loss, essentially, what I'm losing is going to be this new shaded area. When demand is low and demand is high, I have the smaller areas. And essentially, if you put these areas together, they will be smaller in size than the larger area. Right? So you can, when demand is very uncertain, by allowing this minimum price and quantities to adjust, block size to adjust, you kind of can do better things than just having the block size limit. Okay, so this would be like, let's say, the simple insight if you are in an environmental situation where you can put policies, you can put a carbon tax, cap and trade, all of that. Now, the blockchain context is different, right? Because it is permissionless. There are several actors. You have developers, validators, users, and they can have different balance of power in terms of what would be the market equilibrium, what would be the equilibrium prices, and equilibrium block size. The blockchain designer is not a government, so they cannot fully enforce the favorite policies on validators. They can try to put together mechanisms that are incentive compatible in certain aspects, not fully, as many people in this room also have worked on. And also there are many sources of uncertainty. I only showed one, which is demand uncertainty, but also there are uncertainties for validators, and this is related also to the consensus mechanism. For example, proof of work will require more hash power that varies with competition with other validators and demand for the network in general. There are price fluctuations as well, the cryptocurrency price fluctuations as well, especially since people often they denominate their welfare in dollar terms or in real terms. So we need to account for all of this. So what we're going to do then, so in the paper, I look at this. So I write down a model where we have validators that maximize their profits, they have a reward, and they collect fees from transactions. And there is a blockchain designer that looks overall and cares about the social benefit, which the social benefit is either like they want to fill the blocks up to a certain limit, or they want to match some technological, get to a technological target. Now, because the blockchain designer cannot choose these policies, essentially, so the result of this will be from a bargaining game. Here you can think of beta, here will be the bargaining power of the validator. Okay, and I'm going to talk about decentralization down the line as well, and how these map to the case of Bitcoin or Ethereum. And they choose between this quantity setting or price setting regime, ex ante, where you have uncertainty in supply, uncertainty in demand, cryptocurrency price fluctuations. So now, instead of showing equations, I think the best thing is to see what each of these sources of uncertainty, what do they tell us, okay, about which of these we should be doing. Should we just do a good old block size limit, or more sophisticated EIP 1559 type of thing? So the first one is demand uncertainty. So how do I think of demand uncertainty? Consider, for example, here what I call a demand curve, and I give a micro foundation in this paper so that the block size will be inversely proportional, let's say, to the price, okay? So as long as it's decreasing in the price, think of price here as the minimum price that is paid. High demand uncertainty will be a high variance of the shifter here, okay? You can think of this as if you have, for example, different use cases, adoption phases, NFTs, things like that. This will be to high demand uncertainty. So like you can expect, like I showed you earlier, when you have high demand uncertainty, so ChatGPT doesn't know always how to write things, but this is his generation, so that here what you want to do is more of the price controls. Having EIP 59 mechanism helps, okay, because the adjustments to match demand are useful instead of just having a block limit, okay? So that's one first consideration in here. Another one is now the cost to the suppliers now of block space, which is the validators. For example, so you can think of the marginal cost of the validators, which is the cost it takes for them to compute when you have larger blocks, okay? Something that is natural is that there is a positive covariance between this marginal cost and the demand. Why? Let me give an example. So for example, in the case, and this depends also on in the case of proof of work, you know, with the hash rate, there is often when the demand is high, is also where it's more expensive for these validators because they need to compete with more validators bringing more hash rates. Versus, for example, in the proof of stake case, there the cost is essentially more about the staking and the opportunity cost of staking your tokens, but the marginal cost essentially of increasing the block size is essentially constant, so not that correlated with demand. So you can see there then that in the case, for example, here, this is more relevant to case of Bitcoin. So when you have these type of positive correlation between the marginal cost of validators' demand, this leads more into, tilts the balance more in favor of the just keeping on good old block size limit, because the intuition is that if you had price controls here, what would happen is that when in high demands, in high demand, you would have, that would be where it would be more costly for validators to produce, and that's exactly where you have larger blocks. Yeah. And another thing is something that is not mentioned often in the discussions. You know, Ethereum, they just move forward with thinking of, let's do multidimensional EIP59 and so on, is price fluctuations. And we see large price fluctuations. People actually, in fact, they value things not in ETH or Bitcoin, but in dollar terms or in real terms. And now when you have a higher volatility of prices and you account for this, it tilts the balance more into just not doing these price controls, because this price control can be sometimes very large to match demand. So it's more just leading towards just keeping the good old quantity, just setting the quantity, max quantity limit. Another thing I think also that is important, but that is an economist notion that ties to the blockchain application, is essentially how much do prices change? What percentage change in the block space, the price elasticity of the demand? By how much the change in block space per 1% change in base fees? So that would be, let's say, a high elasticity means that the block space would change a lot if the base fees change, the realized block space. So for example, in a faster blockchain, these elasticities tend to be larger because here what happens is that people don't change their prices that much into that short time to be included in the next block. So in the calculation using historical Ethereum data, this elasticity is around 12.6 for Ethereum, and that has actually implications that the adjustment rate is too high of how they increase the prices. Should be around 8% instead of what they have now. Here again, price controls are useful here because this price elasticity amplifies the gains from adjusting the block size to match demand. I don't know how far I'm doing in terms of time. I have 2 more minutes. Okay, perfect. This is my before last slide, which is now thinking of decentralization essentially, and the validator, what I call here the validator bargaining power. And this is also related to the history of, I think, of these 2 blockchains that I mentioned, Ethereum and Bitcoin. Low validator bargaining power here, you can think of it as higher decentralization. Okay, so independent protocol developers or blockchain governance. Maybe in the Bitcoin space that would be more of the case. In that situation, you would have more quantity control being more easier to put in place, and because high decentralization makes it easier for blockchain designer to impose their preferred block size, since that's something that they want. They just want full capacity utilization when they can. And so when we summarize these, I think they line up, in my view, pretty well with what we know with these 2 blockchains. Different use cases. So both of the Bitcoin and Ethereum face significant demand uncertainty. Okay, so that gives room more for the price controls. I think in terms of now correlation between demand uncertainty and marginal cost of validators, that is higher in proof of work than in proof of stake. And so proof of work, then if you have something similar to that, maybe you don't need to do things like EIP 1559 type of policies. If you start having a lot of price fluctuations, then doing EIP 59 policies will create a lot of price fluctuations, which would be bad for the final user who cares about things in dollar or real terms. Fast blockchains are more likely to, are more better off doing more like price controls, like EIP 59. And the least decentralized, the more you have to control the validator with these minimum prices, I think, and some of the history of the way in which EIP59 got introduced is also related to this. There was, at some point, Spark Pool. They had 23% of the hash rate, and they said, we're going to increase the block size because they were voting before. And, so they had to do something like that. So anyway, so I think overall, the main message I think here is that when you consider a specific blockchain, its technical properties, okay, will lead to some of these translate to these economic properties, which leads to the choice between whether you consider more of a good old block size limit or more of a more sophisticated price control to be optimal, and down the line, consider as well beyond this just a general supply schedule and how it should be done. That's all I have. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. That was interesting. Here's sort of a general question, which is how much of this question is driven by the technology of blockchain versus just in general congestion? So if I compare this to like credit cards, for example, where the fee structure is a bit opaque, but I think simpler, right? 3% of your transaction cost. And I don't think about congestion in credit card markets. And so what's coming from sort of the blockchain and what's coming from the monopoly power of the transactor or the recorder?
Yeah. So here you have definitely congestion. Otherwise, you don't need to put fees. I think fees for credit cards are more motivated by you just have the credit card issuer finding that 3% is what maximizes their profit. Here, in the first place, if you didn't have congestion and you are a social planner, you can just give just the minimum payment to the validators, and they have to accept it because that's something you can do. So it's really congestion that makes this need for, like it makes need for transaction fees or TFMs. It's important here. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe a similar question. There's this sort of much older literature in economics about when a regulator wants to put a price control or a quantity control. So I was just wondering, how your results relate to that, or results about,
that's what
demand,
I showed earlier.
That's
the graph that I showed is exactly Weitzman prices versus quantities. And so I just say that the story is not complete. Is that is just when you look at it, that you cannot here impose, on a blockchain setting, you cannot impose any price restrictions. In practice, you cannot, or any quantity restrictions. So that's why I have play this bargaining game where it results from this balance of power. And there is a conflict between, I didn't go into detail on it, but you look at, depending on the situation where you're in, there is a conflict between what would the validators want and what would the designer want. And this is actually something that there is some evidence for it, not even though we talk about MEV all the time. In the Bitcoin setting, for example, there have been examples where people showed papers showing strategic capacity utilization beyond just like empty blocks that come from trying to solve fast, but just people just shrinking the block space to have more fees. So I think think of the different cases I showed you as different pieces of a more general equation of the Weitzman idea. But the Weitzman idea is what motivated, Vitalik Reddit and all that. There's nothing. It's like not every blockchain should just go and say, Weitzman said this, we're going to do EIP 1559. That's kind of maybe one of the takeaway of the paper.
Okay, great. And maybe a quick follow-up. So also, I guess is the conflict so important? Because I could also imagine, welfare maximizing blockchain designers want miners to get a lot of revenues to attract miners. So even if the miners have bargaining power of 0, the blockchain designer might want to attract miners by offering them high revenues in order to secure
but
blockchain.
miner, so there is intrinsically here an externality that the miner will not internalize. You know, the miner will not internalize externalities that when they have to do an operation, everyone else has to do it. And we take those externality into account. If, you know, the blockchain designer wants full blocks and lower fees, essentially, you can think about it as they have a utility on the block size, or there is a technological target that they want with low variance of prices, or, you know, that they, so, you know, there are people who study the question of, you know, monopolistic transaction fee mechanism, but here I think we're just saying there are externalities that a single validator having his current monopoly power doesn't internalize.
Oh, right, no, I agree. I think the idea is very easy to motivate, that you care about the miners' revenues.
Yes.
Yeah.
You care part of the miner revenue, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think
Yeah.
super easy.
One last question. So thanks for the talk. I really appreciate this kind of macro perspective into thinking about transaction fees on blockchains.
Yeah, thank you.
Some of these factors seem to be quite clearly correlated, right? So I might imagine high demand uncertainty is correlated with volatile token price fluctuations.
Yes.
And so when they're in conflict in terms of which force wins, like in your research, is it quantitative? Like, can I take your model to the data and try to see,
Yeah.
given the correlation between demand uncertainty and token price fluctuations, if I could separately identify them,
Yeah,
which direction I want to go?
There is an equation that, because of this stock choice, it is just the advantage of this versus that. But if you were to build, let's say, a full supply schedule, there is an equation for that you can use and say, okay, up to this block size, this would be my supply schedule using, let's say, historical data. Yeah. So what I did was just using historical data, I restricted things to the current Ethereum's dynamic way of adjusting prices and see how they should adjust it.
I see.
But you can take this to data with historical data. I don't know how, you know, historical data has limits, of course we know, but let's call it somewhat empirical. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Abhi.
Thank you.